Good afternoon. My name is Sue Ellen Kadis. I'm a vice chair of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. JCPA is the network hub of the Jewish Community Relations Network, representing 125 local JCRCs and 16 national organizations. We advocate for public policy concerns important to the Jewish community and fight anti-Semitism and racism. We do so in partnership with other ethnic and religious organizations. One of our key roles is to educate the community on the important challenges facing the United States, Israel, and the broader Middle East. If we are better educated, if you are better educated, we will be better advocates in our support for Israel's pursuit of peace and security. Yesterday, we heard from Mara Rudman from the Center for American Progress. Mara was an official with both the Clinton and Obama administrations working on Middle East peace. Today, we are hearing from Bret Stephens, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist at the New York Times. Bret has not only covered Israel, but he has also lived there and reported in Israel from within the country. We are delighted to bring you these two important voices so that you will have a better understanding of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Before I turn it over to our board chair, Michael Fromm, who will be interviewing Bret, I want to ask you to consider making a donation to JCPA via the survey you will receive after the program, or by going to our website, jewishpublicaffairs.org. JCPA puts on some of the best educational forums in the country, but they require resources. We need your support so we can keep the series going. Thank you. I'll now turn it over to Michael Fromm, JCPA chair, who will be interviewing Bret. Michael?
Thank you, Sue Ellen. I'm delighted to be moderating today's session with Bret Stephens on U.S. Middle East policy, especially since over the years, I've had the privilege of discussing this very subject with Bret around the Shabbat dinner table. But today we get to share our conversation with over 1,800 of our closest friends, Bret. So thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Michael.
We invite our audience to submit questions in the question box during the session, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. So please do submit your questions. I want to focus specifically on your expectations, Bret, and your hopes for the Biden administration's Middle East strategy on the heels of some significant moves during the Trump presidency that dramatically shifted existing U.S. policy in the region. Along those lines, many of us have long believed that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the linchpin to Middle East peace, or at least stability in the region. You've suggested that the creation of a Palestinian state should no longer rank highly on the list of American priorities, a position that you made clear at the beginning of the Trump presidency. What drove this counterintuitive argument?
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to those who are listening in. I should probably begin by saying that, at least in theory, I'm in favor of a Palestinian state, so long as that's a state that aims to live in peace with all of its neighbors, not just Israel, but Jordan and Egypt too, and that aims to provide its people with better livelihoods, greater freedoms, and broader opportunities, rather than to simply make war on its neighbors. But I think the lesson of the past now 28 years of peacemaking, going all the way back to the Madrid efforts, now that I think about it, it's closer to 30 years, is that trying to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict by way of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like trying to untie the Gordian knot. And one president after another from both parties has attempted to do it, and it hasn't worked, and in many ways it has backfired spectacularly. So starting 4 years ago, when I was still at the Wall Street Journal, I began advocating a different approach. The common approach is what you might think of as an inside-out approach. That is to say, solve the differences between Jerusalem and Ramallah, and you'll solve the differences between Jerusalem and Riyadh. But maybe that's mistaken, and the evidence shows that it's mistaken. Maybe the real lesson is that you have to work from the outside in. That is to say, find places of strategic commonality between Israel and the wider and its wider world, both Arab and non-Arab, and perhaps as that process unfolds, the salience of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict won't be quite as great. If Palestinians observe that Israel is at peace not only with Egypt and Jordan, but with the UAE, with Bahrain, potentially quite soon with Oman, with Morocco, with Sudan, ultimately the prize with Saudi Arabia itself, Palestinians might be less inclined, or rather more inclined, to join that circle of peace, and Israelis will have greater confidence that in helping usher in a Palestinian state, they will not be putting themselves at quite the risks that a previous generation of Israelis might have feared. So this seems to be the central insight at the heart of the Abraham Accords. And the argument that I laid out in a long article and commentary this month is that those accords don't simply represent two additional Arab states joining Egypt and Jordan in recognizing Israel. Those accords represent a fundamental revolution in thinking about the nature of the Israeli-Arab conflict and about the role that the United States might play, if it's wise, in advancing it or ending it.
So let's talk about the Abraham Accords. Yesterday, we held a forum on this same subject with Mara Rudman, who's a fellow at the Center for American Progress and a former advisor to Presidents Clinton and Obama. And she maintains that President Biden fully intends to support the direction of the Abraham Accords, this outside-in approach that you mentioned. Do you share her confidence?
I think it's too soon to tell. And, look, I am a well-wisher of this administration, even though everyone knows that I come from the conservative side of the political spectrum. I think the United States desperately needs a successful presidency, and I think it needs a presidency that can achieve victories. Jimmy Carter had the good sense to build on the work of the Nixon and Ford administrations in creating bridges of trust between Egypt and Israel. And so there's no reason that the Biden administration can't do the same when it comes to building on the Abraham Accords. But if they're going to do that, I think they're going to need to change their approach in two respects. Number one, going back and trying to restart the so-called peace process between Jerusalem and Ramallah is a fool's errand. Now, I just finally watched The Queen's Gambit, and if you're playing the same moves with the same pieces, you're going to get the same result. If you're going to try to get Netanyahu and Abbas into a room and try to achieve roughly the same outcome, it is going to fail, as the Kerry talks failed in 2014, as the Annapolis summit failed in 2007, as the Camp David Accords failed in 2000. So that has to, the salience of Israeli-Palestinian relations as a major focus of American foreign policy, I think has to be put in its proper perspective. The second aspect, and here I'm a little bit more worried, is that the United States needs a relationship with Saudi Arabia. This is not because the Saudis are great guys. It's not because we shouldn't be outraged by the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. It's not because Saudi Arabia has suddenly become the kind of country that we would all like it to be. But in foreign policy in general, and in the Middle East in particular, it's important that the United States pick sides and demonstrate its reliability as an ally. When the Biden administration takes the Houthis off the list of state sponsors of terror, and the first thing that the Houthis do is start attacking Saudi Arabia, that is not a confidence-building sign by the Biden administration. When they review the arms sales to the United Arab Emirates when it comes to F-35, which the Israelis have said they're fine with, that again is a bad sign. And the worst possible sign, and I'm sure we're going to get to this, Michael, is the eagerness with which the Biden administration, or the eagerness the Biden administration shows in trying to re-enter the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. You know, it's important to learn for the Biden administration not to repeat the mistakes of the Trump administration, but in some ways, Michael, it's even more important for them not to repeat the mistakes of the Obama administration.
So a question from our audience and a natural follow-up to your previous comment is, do you see any signs that the Palestinians are moderating their line towards Israel in the wake of these accords?
No. I wish there were. And look, I think it's going to take a new generation of Palestinian leaders. As someone pointed out the other day, Mahmoud Abbas is in the 17th year of his 4-year elected term of office. I covered his one and only election back in January of 2005. He's still there. The Palestinian line towards the Abraham Accords was essentially rejectionist from the beginning to the end. And I think there's going to be, there's a desperate need for new political leadership among the Palestinians that is not the old line of Fatah, and very hopefully it's not the old line of Hamas. Where that's going to come from, I think, is hard to see, but it is more likely to happen when Palestinians say to themselves, we are never going to be able to destroy Israel demographically, militarily, or diplomatically or politically. This is a state that we need to learn to live in peace with, and maybe at that point there can be a real conversation. I don't think we're at that point yet.
So besides supporting the Abraham Accords, what other early moves would give you confidence that a Biden administration accepts these new dynamics in the Middle East and doesn't fall victim to what you've described in the past as the usual tendency of incoming administrations from the opposing party to view everything done by their immediate predecessor as dangerous, stupid, or both?
Well, look, one thing that the Biden administration did that I thought was well judged was to ratify the Trump administration's decision not to sell F-35s to Turkey, which I think is very important because we are looking at the emergence of Turkey as the second great malefactor in the Middle East after of course, Iran. The most important aspect, of course, is the way in which they approach the Iranian question, which is how much eagerness will the Biden administration show for re-entering a deal at any cost? And will they be stampeded by Iran's moves to enrich uranium to ever higher percentages of purity into conceding core American positions, or positions that at least ought to remain core, like the necessity of extending the sunset on many of the provisions that, on arms, on enrichment, and so on, that the JCPOA had. And I think the best thing the Biden administration could do is tell the Iranians, look, we're interested in getting back into a deal. We have other priorities. Here's our phone number if you want to do X, Y, and if you're serious about re-engaging and getting sanctions lifted. I won't get into the question of Rob Malley. That's another story, but maybe someone wants to raise it.
Well, I was going to ask you how ominous you felt the appointment of Mr. Malley is regarding Iran. If you want to skip that, we can move on to another question.
No, I mean, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I think that the guy, I wrote a column titled "Dissidents First," of foreign policy guide for the Biden administration, in which I said that, a good way for Biden to refocus American foreign policy would be to focus on dissidents like Navalny in Russia, or my friend Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, or the people who are in Evin prison in Iran, which is to say, we're happy to negotiate on a wide range of subjects, but we need to be satisfied that these dissidents are free. They're not being imprisoned. They're not at risk of death. They're not being tortured, and so on. And in passing, I was distressed to find that. I was just distressed to find that Malley was being considered for a senior position, which indeed is what he got, as the point man on Iran. And I think people who have followed Malley's career know that he's highly intelligent, highly well-versed in the region, But some of his judgments, for instance, his counsel to President Obama in the last 4 years of the Obama administration to essentially go soft on Bashar Assad, proved to be both a strategic and humanitarian disaster, which with repercussions that have extended for quite some time. More importantly, George Shultz just died, and George Shultz was famous for taking American ambassadors who had just been appointed to one country or another, taking them to a globe in his office in the State Department, and saying, point me to your country on the globe. And sometimes these people would point to Indonesia or the Philippines or whatever, Sierra Leone, and Shultz would move their finger and say, your country is the United States. And that is to say, we need a foreign policy that advances the interests of the United States, that is not simply attempting to make the United States a broker between the interests of our adversaries or our allies in the region. And I wish the ghost of George Shultz would move Rob Malley's finger to the United States so that he understands that he is representing America's interest, not trying to represent Iran's interest to America.
So given your comments on Malley, and also given the fact that President Biden has committed to rejoin the JCPOA, how would you specifically, what are some moves that you could specifically cite that would help the president honor his commitments without compromising the interests of Israel and the Gulf states?
You need to be a little more specific with your question.
In the context of rejoining the Iran agreement, it's important to you that certain commitments are met, but at the same time without betraying Israel's interests. Are there certain specifics that you could name in terms of Biden's administration and his approach to the JCPOA that would meet that commitment and avoid compromising Israel's interests?
I think America's core interests are to assure ourselves that one of the world's most dangerous regimes doesn't get within 100 miles of acquiring nuclear weaponry or the means to acquire nuclear weaponry. I don't think Biden is any more, there is nothing that commits the Biden administration other than a broad desire to rejoin the JCPOA. And everybody on this call knows that whatever we rejoin is not going to be a duplicate of the JCPOA. So I think the best thing that the Biden administration could do is say, we're interested in rejoining the JCPOA or having a nuclear agreement with Iran, as we're interested in many things. It's not necessarily a priority. This is a list of things that Iran has to do. In the meantime, we understand the difference between our friends and our enemies in the region, and we're going to support our friends to the hilt. That's a very important point here, which is that the question of America's reliability as an ally is central to our interests in the region and our ability to corral various countries in the region when for the sake of some larger purpose that we might have here. And so it's important to send early signals, and I don't think these signals have quite yet been sent, that we are going to stand by our traditional allies in the region. I find it strange that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden haven't yet had a conversation, and maybe there's some trivial bureaucratic reason for that. But if the Biden White House is going to play out the same way that the Obama White House did, in which the president simply has a personal animus toward the Israeli prime minister that he wants to advertise, I think things are going to go badly. American presidents deal with all sorts of foreign leaders with whom they might have good or unpleasant relations all the time, and that should not be a factor in the way the U.S. conducts itself.
So you would advocate for not jumping back into the agreement on the exact same terms that were in place when President Trump left it?
Yeah, I would say that, look, the most important thing is to get to an agreement that works for the United States and that provides us and our allies more solid assurances than the JCPOA did, that we are not going to do more to encourage Iran's regional ambitions and nuclear ambitions than we will to discourage them. And the best way of doing it is to say we're not necessarily all that eager to get into another negotiation. We have huge problems in this country around the economy, the pandemic, racial equity, and so on, and much larger strategic issues in the world today as well, especially in East Asia. The Iranians can wait, and let them know that we think they can wait.
Before we leave the subject of Iran, do you believe the prospects of an Israeli military strike or military action against Iran is more likely during the current strategic environment?
That's very hard to say. I mean, I think that I remember 10 years ago when Netanyahu came into office, I was pretty sure he was going to strike. And as it turned out, we later learned he very much wanted to strike, and his hand was stayed by the inner, national security cabinet of the Israeli government. So that's very hard to predict. And we've heard competing things out of Israel. You had obviously the chief of staff making some very strong statements about a week or two ago. A slightly different tone from Mr. Cohen at the Mossad. So I think it's foolish to predict these sorts of things, in part because, as we have learned, Israel has means at its disposal to inhibit or delay or diminish Iran's nuclear capabilities that don't require the kind of Osirak-style military options that used to be sort of the expected methods of achieving results.
Right. Let's go back to comparing the two administrations. You've observed that the U.S. acting with a pro-Israel bias did not hurt our standing with Arab allies, and if anything, may have done the opposite. Why do you feel the Gulf states, which previously insisted on waiting for peace with the Palestinians, were now willing to normalize ties with Israel? And which countries do you think might likely be next?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, waiting on the Palestinians turned out to be an exercise in waiting on Godot. So that was, I think that was a large part of the problem. Not only that, but sort of making the Palestinian issue the hinge on which Arab-Israeli cooperation depended, gave sort of essentially small-time leaders in Ramallah an effective veto over the strategic interests of Arab countries, and I think they got sick of that as well. Prince Bandar, I believe, made some rather striking comments to this effect not too long ago. The second thing, obviously, is that for a variety of reasons, including doubts about American reliability, the Arab states increasingly look to Israel as a solid ally against a common enemy, that's to say, Tehran. And Israel has demonstrated again and again that it has the will, imagination, and wherewithal to stand up to an imperialist power in the country. I mean, Iran is an imperialist power. I find it striking that people don't make the point that a country that effectively controls much of Iraq, much of Syria, almost all of Lebanon, much of Yemen. This is almost the definition of imperialism, except it's an empire that's not a Western empire. I think the third thing, and this is very important, is that countries like the UAE and Bahrain have understood that a generation or two generations of reliance on energy wealth have poisoned their systems, and that in the future they are going to have to rely more on their human resources than their mineral resources in order to stay in the game of being serious countries. Israel is a model in that respect, and it's not just that Israel can provide X technology to the UAE or Y technology to Bahrain to help them with one technological challenge or another. It's that Israel models what you do to cultivate human talent in order to become a wealthy country without having to rely on whatever happens to be underground. The UAE understands that, I think, profoundly, and I think we will look at Mohammed bin Zayed as one of the most far-sighted leaders of today. And I think other countries in the region are getting the point too. I have met with MBS, and when you meet with him, he shows a lot of enthusiasm. Unfortunately, when you actually watch what he does, it gives you pause about his judgment.
So you've argued in the past that in the early 2000s, the U.S. was trapped in an unworkable paradigm of the Middle East, whereas the government of Israel saw things differently and indeed more clearly. And I think they were ultimately vindicated. Is that what you're referring to when you talk about their understanding of what it takes to be an economic, cultural, and developmental leader in the region, and using that as the calling card for diplomatic relations?
Sorry, who are you referring to here?
To Israel, in the sense that the U.S. had this distorted paradigm of the Middle East, and Israel saw it very clearly and capitalized on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, what I think happened with Israel is that it understood that in order to be loved, it first had to be respected. And one of the problems that I think in hindsight, and this is dime store psychology, but love without respect is a bad basis for love. So, you know, the love that flowed to the Rabin government in 1993 after the Oslo Accords fizzled very quickly, because the deal was Israel has to give up X, Y, and Z. And if it doesn't continue to give up X, Y, and Z, we're going to withdraw our support for it. Sometime after the Second Intifada, which I lived through as editor of the Jerusalem Post, the paradigm shifted under Sharon, under Olmert, but most particularly under Netanyahu, which is that Israel doesn't need to ask for the love of its neighbors or of the international community or even the United States. It needs to be respected. And it needs to be respected above all by insisting on certain baseline conditions for talking to people, for negotiations, for concessions, and so on. And I think that was really quite fundamental. Now, of course, it helps that during this 20-year period, Israel went from being, as I remember at the beginning of 2002, a nation under siege, an economy in a state of collapse, to being a world leader in almost everything it does. Now, I'm proud to say also in getting shots into the arms of its people. So Israel became a stronger country, but I think there was also a psychological change that was every bit as important. And standing up, by the way, you know, this is going to take me back to an argument I had 5 years ago with some of my friends. But back in 2015, when Bibi went to Washington to give a speech, a lot of members of the American Jewish community said, "Oh, it's terrible. You know, he's endangering the most important relationship that he has. He's infuriating, you know, the president. How can he do this?" Well, that speech turned out to be a very well-judged political decision, because part of the audience that was looking at him wasn't just Democrats in the well of the House. They were Arab ambassadors watching on TV and saying, "I agree with him."
So with this shift in strategy to normalize relations with the various Arab countries, people in our audience may be wondering where that leaves the status of more direct efforts to address the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Are there circumstances under which the U.S. should ramp up its engagement on this front? And are there steps the U.S. can take now, short of an all-out push for statement, that might improve future prospects for peace?
I think the best thing that can happen is to tell the Palestinians that a state can be theirs if they are willing to live within certain limits. And that's a message that has to come not just from President Biden or Secretary Blinken. I hope it comes from President Macron. I hope it comes from Chancellor Merkel. I hope they hear it from their friends in the Arab world as well. This is the basic problem here is that the world has elevated the Palestinian question to one of the great foremost questions of the day, right? Let's imagine that tomorrow a Palestinian state were ushered into existence along the lines of the 1967 borders. What exactly would that solve? Would it solve the crisis in Yemen? Would it solve the economic collapse in Lebanon? Would it solve the Iranian bid to acquire nuclear weapons? What problems for the United States would it actually solve? The president would pay a visit, to East Jerusalem, I guess the future Palestinian capital, perhaps. I'm speculating. This is a scenario. And then what happens? Nothing. A 23rd Arab state is born. It achieves extraordinarily little. So I am for the United States working toward a Palestinian state that looks like Costa Rica, that is small but beautiful, democratic, progressive, environmentally sound, and happy to be a force of good in its region. But what can the United States do? I think the best thing the United States can do is look after its own interests, and the Palestinian question is not a central interest for the United States. And the sooner we understand that, I think the better American interests will be served.
So a natural question, though, on that subject would be, can a two-state solution be achieved with or without the inclusion of Hamas?
I think a two-state solution with the inclusion of Hamas, first of all, is a non-starter diplomatically. Second of all, is a recipe for endless war. What is Hamas? Hamas is nothing other than a political organization dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. So right. that is what it is. You could, if Hamas were to rename itself and completely change its not only its charter but its values and its aims, then that would be a possibility. But the suggestion that we need to include a terrorist organization as part of an overall negotiated settlement puts that settlement in every conceivable respect further out of reach, and shows Israelis, and frankly ought to show the world, that the Palestinians aren't serious. You can't simply say, we're going to have this organization as a major political player here, and by the way, this organization doesn't really accept the basic terms into which the basic rules of the game that it's playing here, right? Because it doesn't accept a Palestinian state within the 67 borders. It doesn't accept a Jewish state within any borders. So it's a little bit like allowing a fascist party in some country to play by the rules of democracy, hope that it wins, and when it wins, the rules of democracy no longer apply to it. So if you go down that road, you are ensuring failure.
So since the settlements and expansion of the settlements was an issue that was part of the UAE negotiations, what's your opinion on whether the Biden administration will abide by President Bush's previous commitments regarding neutrality on settlement building and the settlement blocks? Do you have a feel for how Biden sees the settlements as an issue?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, there's a very traditional Democratic position that Kerry insisted on, which is that the settlements were at the core of a core issue in the conflict. I have to tell you, I wish that were true, because if the core of the conflict came down to the territorial question, which is essentially the settlement question, then get rid of the settlements, right? I mean, if that's your problem, then just move. If you were to tell me with the authority of, a man from the future, that if all you had to do was get rid of the settlements and Israel would achieve perpetual peace with Palestinians and its neighbors, I wouldn't see the problem with that. But the experience is that Israel withdrew every settlement and every settler from Gaza, and it didn't get more peace, it got more war. So why on earth, if you're an Israeli, would you want to replicate that experiment on a much larger scale in places much closer to your heartland as a country? I think it's insane. And I think it's also remarkable that the same people who tell me, and I agree with them, that Israel has to remain both Jewish and democratic, I agree with that, okay? But if that's the case, then respect the judgment that Israeli democracy continues to make by looking with suspicion at the idea of a Palestinian state after the hard-won experience or hard-bitten experience of what happened in Gaza. I hear a lot of my friends on the Democratic side going on and on about this. Democracy, democracy, democracy. Well, democracy for the last 12 years has meant Netanyahu governments. And before that, it meant Olmert, who was a former Likudnik, and before that, it meant Sharon. That didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen in a vacuum that Meretz and Labor, the parties of the left, vanished. There was a great historic debate in the country, and the left lost. And if the left can't quite figure that out, it's going to continue to lose. There is a possibility, a real possibility, of a Palestinian state down the road, but that's a Palestinian state that's going to have to emerge in a much different way than the traditional land for peace type of formula.
So since the advertised subject of our talk today was the Biden administration, given President Biden's frame of reference, and you've been very critical of the Obama administration's policies on the Middle East, based on who you see the president surrounding himself with as advisors on the subject and the trends that have occurred and the shifts in US policy over the last 4 years, give us a sense of your expectations for a Biden administration in terms of Middle East policy. Are you optimistic? I recognize, and you said in your commentary piece, that we need a successful presidency, and we need a successful presidency domestically and internationally. Is your cup half full or cup half empty?
My cup is always half full. You got to be an optimist. Look, it's more than half full, okay? I was delighted by Tony Blinken's, the choice of Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, of Ron Klain as Chief of Staff. I complained about Rob Malley, but for all I know, the guy will surprise me, and I'd be happy to be surprised. By the way, I should say, since this is the world of Zoom or whatever format we're on, that I don't want to suggest that Rob Malley's allegiances aren't ultimately aren't to the United States. I hope that no one read me that way. So I hope for the best from this administration, and everybody should. People should be rooting for this administration to succeed. The United States cannot afford another dismal, embittering presidency. We have to have wins as America, and we actually have in the Middle East really a potential great win, which is the prospect of the end of 73 years of endless warfare between Israel and the Arab world. And when you think about American foreign policy crises, Michael, in the past few decades, 1956, a crisis in the Middle East leads to a crisis between the United States and two of its leading European allies. 1973, a crisis in the Middle East leads to a DEFCON alert and brings the United States and the Soviet Union closer. 1982 leads to the deployment of American troops and the tragic loss of hundreds of American Marines and diplomats in Beirut. 1991, the Scud missile attacks, again, another crisis. America stands to win immensely if this conflict can be finally brought to something like an end, and not least it stands to win because if the Obama administration, or the Biden administration is thinking about a pivot. If the next great zone of tension and conflict for the United States is not going to be the Persian Gulf, but the South China Sea, then to the extent that we can reconcile ancient enemies and move on, we're going to be well served as a country.
Thank you. That's a great response. As a final question, you know the American Jewish community very well, and it's fair to assume that many of our audience members are involved in local and national Jewish organizations. What do you think the posture of the mainstream American institutions ought to be towards the Biden administration on its Middle East policies and strategy? And how would you advise us on making sure our messaging is both supportive, but at the same time attempts to move the administration in the right direction? Do you have any advice on that subject?
Look, I mean, I would only say, as Obama used to say about Israel, friends owe one another their honest judgment. So the Jewish community, I mean, it's a very diverse Jewish community, not just religiously or ethnically, but politically, to say the least. But I think the Biden administration will do well to get the honest judgment of the Jewish community. And I think it's important for us to be able to distinguish core issues from peripheral ones, right? The core issue, as far as I'm concerned, is that the United States should never do anything that puts Israel's existence in danger. And doing so requires that the Biden administration listen a little to Israel. They're not such fools. They know their region. They understand power and how and perception in the region. And I would ask that the Biden administration listen very carefully to those Israeli voices. And I'm not just talking about Bibi, but I'm talking about a range of Israeli voices who understand that there's a reason why there was almost near unanimity in Israel against the JCPOA, why certain sorts of decisions by the Obama administration didn't work. There is no rule that says that the Biden administration has to be the third Obama term. Biden is his own man with his own judgments and his own team, and he can learn from the mistakes of all of his predecessors. And but the spirit of our engagement should not be hostile, should not be suspicious, should not be mean-spirited. As I said, I am rooting for this team from the sidelines as a Jew and as an American.
Well, thank you. This has been a great session. It's great to see you again. I really appreciate your insights. We had over 1,800 people registered for today's webinar, so you can imagine there are a lot of people in our audience who really enjoyed and took some great insights from your comments. So thank you again, and we look forward to having you on JCPA's webinars in the future.
Michael, thank you so much. It's an honor.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.